What's happening, y'all? Welcome inside the Fantasy Stock Exchange. Danny and Bush coming at you with our 2021 fantasy football lessons learned. This is where we, dive into some of the things that we did right, some of the things that we did wrong coming into this season, and reflect on how the season actually played out. Some of the guys that taught us some lessons that we can take into next season. I know this is one of my favorite videos every year to make. I know it's one of yours as well, because one, we get to reflect on some of the things that we hit on, and also we get to learn from our misses. So, Danny, how you doing today?
Doing well, doing well. And yeah, as you kind of alluded to, this is one of the more informative videos you guys are going to watch on YouTube. If you guys are following a lot of fantasy football content, not many truly break down what exactly happened this season and lessons that we could really carry toward our 2022 fantasy drafts. And honestly, this is a learning experience for me myself, like just going through my biggest misses, my biggest hits, and determining from a macro level what exactly went into the process behind them. And if you want to be a better fantasy player, you have to understand the processes of selecting players, and this is one of the best videos to be able to do so.
For sure. So if you guys do enjoy this video, please leave a like, comment any of your thoughts down below. Maybe what was your biggest hit, biggest miss this year, or some of the lessons that you took away from this season, and subscribe to the channel if you are new. But without further ado, we're going to hit the intro and then we're going to get right into this. Okay, so we basically have a bunch of lessons. We'll call them 10 lessons that we've learned. Some of them we got right. Some of them we got wrong. We're going to start with one that we got right, and one that I would say I specifically got right because I was a little bit higher on this player than you were.
Yeah.
What Jonathan Taylor taught us. I think it's probably a good idea for us to learn from the league-winning players, and Jonathan Taylor was probably the biggest example of a guy that won people leagues this year. And Jonathan Taylor taught me a couple things. One, the macro side of spotting the JT breakout came with a lot of philosophies of league-winning running backs. And what I mean by that was one of the primary reasons, the most fundamental reasons we were on guys like Jonathan Taylor and Antonio Gibson, DeAndre Swift. It's because young running backs are usually a smart idea to invest in to get that elite league-winning ceiling, because the unknown factor, the uncertainty avoidance that a lot of people tend to have in their drafts, would rather take a Joe Mixon and Nick Chubb, somebody who they know what they're getting. And even though Joe Mixon worked out and was still great this season, some other people probably took Nick Chubb over Jonathan Taylor because they thought, it's a safer pick. You don't lose your draft, or you don't win your draft in the first round, but you certainly can lose it. That is the most Fugazi narrative in fantasy football. You absolutely can win your draft in the first and second round. One thing I think we did really well this year, though, is identifying the paths and creating that roadmap for the elite season for whatever running back we were talking about, right? Because if you guys go on a trip, let's say if I wanted to drive to California right now and I didn't have a map on how to get there, I would just be driving. Like, I wouldn't know exactly where I'm going. So the fact that we have history of elite league-winning running backs, we can use that as a roadmap to help create that path for an elite league-winning running back like Jonathan Taylor was.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that because, again, having a roadmap tells you what you're looking for. And looking back on it, I mean, Jonathan Taylor hit all the peripherals we were looking for. Talking about, I mean, you guys should have been able to see the graphic or are about to see the graphic on the screen, but all of the peripherals for a Jonathan Taylor breakout, talking about the efficiency, talk about the workload, talk about the touchdown opportunity, talk about the offensive line and the age, everything was there to have that breakout Dalvin Cook-like path to a league-winning type of season. And we saw Jonathan Taylor not only hit what we expected, but hit every single threshold in spades.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm glad you brought that up because back in June, as you guys will recall, I did a video titled What Makes a League-Winning Running Back? And when I talked about Jonathan Taylor, his path was what I would call the Dalvin Cook path. He needs a lot of carries, a lot of touchdowns, good efficiency, good offensive line. Offense, wasn't necessarily important. We knew he wasn't going to get elite target volume because of Nyheim Hines' presence there and the contract extension that he signed. But the fact that he was going to be efficient, get a lot of carries, get a lot of red zone opportunity was the path that he had to an elite league-winning running back season. And as you guys can see also, the eventual numbers, what ended up happening, were very similar to what I predicted. So that was probably, I would say, probably my biggest hit of the entire season was predicting the Jonathan Taylor breakout. He was labeled as my league-winning running back in our draft guide, if you guys had our draft guide. Going into 2022, though, it is very important to identify the paths of running backs on how they get there, right? Because not only will it help you spot breakouts like Jonathan Taylor, it'll also help you spot busts like we're going to talk about in a few seconds. So determining the likelihood and this year of the players that we're talking about in ADP is very, very important because the likelihood that they're going to achieve a league-winning running back season or they're going to bust is how you determine if they're a good draft pick or not. And if you determine they don't have a league-winning ceiling, then take a wide receiver, take a tight end, take a quarterback, whatever the case is.
Yeah, and again, I'll quickly say this before going into the next point, the next lesson that we learned. But yeah, being able to embrace uncertainty and go with your projection, go with the research that you did is ultimately how you ended up with Jonathan Taylor on a lot of your teams. Now, we're going to talk about some older running backs, some safer bog standard running backs later on in this video that I specifically got one wrong in particular. But yeah, I mean, it just kind of goes to show you the landscape of the running back position is a young position. So genuinely speaking, if you have a tiebreaker, go with the younger player every single time.
For sure. So I'll let you talk about another league-winning player that we didn't get right, obviously. And this is one that definitely stung us because we were very adamant in how bad this guy was going to be, and he really, really killed us. So I'll let you talk about Deebo Samuel here.
Yeah, I mean, what Deebo Samuel taught us is that understanding context and scheme matters. We can look at all the underlying numbers. We can look at, how does he separate against man coverage? How does he do as an X wide receiver compared to a slot wide receiver? Like how many targets should he get down the field? Like we can look at all the peripherals and they do matter to a degree, but we should be able to spot out the outliers. We should be able to spot out contextual players that it really doesn't matter as much to. And Deebo Samuel should have been a prime example coming into this year. We were quick to point out all offseason that, Deebo Samuel had this low yards per target, a player with an extensive injury history, posted poor separation, yada, yada, all that fugaz in 2020 without truly contextualizing the fact that why was his yards per target lower? Why was his separation versus man coverage lower? And what did it truly mean to his usage in this offense? And how exactly these 2020 factors impacted his bottom line? Well, we know now that Deebo Samuel is a top player in the NFL in terms of yards after catch ability. And his statistical downfalls were more so of a product of a dwindling situation and injury issues in 2020. More so than him being a bog standard bad player. So his target depth was always going to be low given his role in the Niners offense. But we should have expected that was going to be counteracted with the fact that even though his yards per target down the field were going to be low, he was going to make up for it with the fact that he is the best yards after catch receiver in the NFL. So that was going to even itself regardless. And his recovery from the 2020 foot injury should have been apparent to us. I mean, he fractured his foot in 2020, impacted his numbers significantly. We didn't give him the benefit of the doubt that the 2021 offseason would have proved useful for him in recovering from that injury, and it proved useful in spades. You guys can see the efficiency numbers on the screen, but I mean, again, we know 5th in receiving yards, 2nd in yards after catch, 2nd in total touchdowns, and 3rd in fantasy points per game. But the efficiency numbers are the ones that I truly want to take away here, because for a guy that we said is, an inefficient, fugazi little David Johnson has more yards per target type of player, I mean, that completely flipped on its head this year. I mean, 1st in yards per reception, 1st in yards per target, 4th in yards per route run, 1st in fantasy points per route run, and 1st in fantasy points per target, while also being the 5th leading receiver in terms of expected points added, despite not working down the field like a, Tyreek Hill. So, I mean, his role is clear. It should have been clear coming in. And as we know now, he is the key cog in a Kyle Shanahan scheme. If you have a creative enough play caller that understands his players' strengths, matched with someone with elite specific abilities like Deebo Samuel, the ceiling is a match made in heaven, which is what we ultimately saw with Samuel in 2021.
Yeah, I think there's a couple other mini lessons that we can take away from Deebo Samuel. Number one, he was a 3rd-year wide receiver, right, coming into the season. Yeah. And we were very high on his teammate, Brandon Ayuk, who was a 2nd-year wide receiver. And I think we forget that, young receivers are young receivers. 2nd, 3rd year doesn't really matter. They still have upside to achieve and ascend as players. And Deebo Samuel's, like you said, his 2020 season was completely derailed by the fact that he had a foot injury in June before the season even started. Once he came back, he was still dealing with stuff. And we forgot about the player that we saw in 2019. We forgot about the player that led San Francisco to the playoffs and to the Super Bowl in 2019. And that should have been more apparent to us. And that's an oversight on our part. So definitely apologize for that one, because Deebo Samuel won a lot of people some leagues and almost won me our listener dynasty league, but I did not quite, take advantage of that Deebo Samuel advantage. And also the zone coverage factor is very, very important, because a lot more teams are playing zone in the NFL than they are playing man. And the fact that he can win at such a high rate against zone coverage, and we're going to talk about another guy in a few minutes who also won at a very high rate against zone coverage and another reason why he was a league-winning wide receiver this year, that should have been more apparent to us as well. It doesn't matter how you win, whether it's man, zone, press, whatever. If you can win, then you can produce in fantasy, should have been the takeaway for us, and it wasn't. So let's get into another guy that we were right about, and I swear Danny's going to take some victory laps in a couple seconds, but Mark Andrews taught us a couple things, right? Obviously, Mark Andrews was the tight end one in fantasy this year, and there were a couple factors at play here. Number one, betting on a young, productive player is always smart, right? That was always the draw of Mark Andrews, because this was a guy that had finished as the tight end 4 in points per game in 2019 and in 2020. So he had 2 top 5 seasons under his belt in only his 4th NFL season coming into this year. So barely being on the field, if you guys see his efficiency, based on the snap percentage and the routes run per season, the fact that this guy was finishing as a top 5 tight end on this low of usage, like in 2020, Logan Thomas finished as a top 5 tight end. He quite literally had doubled the amount of routes run that Mark Andrews had. He had nearly 700 route run to 350 for Mark Andrews. So the biggest 2 takeaways from Andrews are betting on efficiency and limited usage, and also the fact that putting the puzzle pieces together when it comes to an offensive philosophy change is very, very important. Because if you guys, were paying attention last year, you would have known that the Ravens were going to a more pass-heavy approach. It was pretty obvious when you looked at the moves that they made. They drafted a first-round wide receiver in Rashad Bateman. They signed Sammy Watkins, who for some reason they were really high on. Greg Roman talked about it constantly. Every time they talked about their offense was, we like what Rashad can do for us. We like what Hollywood and Andrews can do for us. We think we're going to be a lot more dangerous as a pass-heavy approach this year, because this was a team that, bar none, was the most run-heavy in the entire NFL, and it wasn't close for the last 2 years before this year. And then on top of all that, we had injuries to their top 2 running backs right before the season, with J.K. Dobbins and Gus Edwards both suffering major injuries. So the fact that, as you guys can see on the screen, Mark Andrews' routes nearly doubled and his snaps went up by 10% shouldn't be a huge, huge surprise to a lot of people that were paying attention.
Yeah, no, I mean, we saw the trajectory, and the fact is this guy was so efficient despite those limited routes that, again, if he were able to hit the route usage that he saw this year, this was always in his range of outcomes. And again, although we were right, obviously we couldn't have truly predicted the breakout that he had, but nonetheless, again, we predicted that their pass volume was going to go up, as you mentioned. We predicted that Mark Andrews was going to be a key contributor in that. And again, as you said, his routes nearly doubled this year. If this offense even like remotely was the same, he was going to be a good player in return on ADP. But the fact of the matter is this went from the league worst in terms of pass percentage in these past couple years to being an average passing team. And as a result, Mark Andrews was the benefactor, was the tight end 1 in fantasy football, and won quite a few amount of people leagues. I mean, he was absolutely dominant down the stretch, especially in those fantasy playoffs, despite really this season having stretches of time where he wasn't even playing with Lamar Jackson. I mean, this is a player that shouldn't be making it out of your top 3 rounds next year, top 2.5, even like you go mid-3rd is probably his floor. And you were getting him at times in the 5th, 6th round going into 2021. So I absolutely agree. Again, we kind of projected this coming in and it came to fruition.
Yep, exactly. And I think maybe some people are going to be hesitant because Huntley did so much damage with Mark Andrews this year, but they shouldn't, because I think Andrews would have done that with Lamar anyway, just based on the matchups that they were playing. So let's get into the next lesson. Definitely one that we were both wrong on. Probably our second biggest miss behind Deebo Samuel this year. I'll let you talk about Joe Mixon.
Yeah, I mean, we have to talk about Joe Mixon. He's kind of the staple of the FSC brand. Everybody calls us Joe Mixon haters pretty much. I mean, we hate on the inefficient running back. But either way, let's give him some credit. Let's give him his flowers. He was a truly good difference-making running back, a top 5 best ball win rate type of running back this year. So got to show him his flowers, got to give him the respect he deserves, because at the end of the day here, the main lesson that we have to take away is that we need to understand the context behind predictive and non-predictive injuries and help you determine which players are actually values and which are landmines in your drafts. And as a community, we show a recency bias in devaluing players that have, cost us in recent years or got hurt in my fantasy playoffs and ruined my fantasy championship chances. And Joe Mixon was the prime example of this in terms of what we at FSC basically got wrong in 2021. I mean, entering the year, we had concerns over his efficiency, his wear and tear. He was always seemingly banged up. And as a result of that, potentially if we saw a workload decrease with his extensive ailment history, and we were really short-sighted and let this bias affect us in terms of our drafting, on a micro level, again, we were lower on Mixon. We don't like the player as a whole. I mean, there is some inherent bias there. Like, I'm not going to hide that. But on a macro level, we were also affected by the recency bias of his situation. I feel like the most applicable player in terms of what we learned from Mixon and even Austin Eckler to a lower degree, though we weren't letting it affect us as much, is going to be Christian McCaffrey. When the upside in point ceiling is worth the injury risk that recency bias plants on us, that's how we find ourselves with extreme draft values. Mixon was an extreme draft value at that 2-3 turn, mid-2 type of area he was going in 2021. Christian McCaffrey is going to be that guy if he escapes the top 5 going into 2022.
Yeah, exactly. And I think within reason, like you have kind of laid out there, you don't want to be, all in on Cam Akers next year and ignore the torn Achilles, because that's a serious injury. That's something, that we need to take into context. But Christian McCaffrey, who dealt with hamstring and ankle injuries this year, like, this is the prime example of recency bias is going to knock him down boards. Probably same goes with Saquon Barkley too. Although he did come off of a major injury this year, he still only dealt with minor things in 2021. Those two guys specifically kind of stand out to me as guys that may fall a little bit further than they should, just based on the injury history and the ticky-tack stuff that we've seen them deal with. And we got to remember that is a risk of running backs, right? We can't go into a draft and say, I'm not going to draft Joe Mixon because he deals with knee and ankle injuries all the time. It's like, then pick a wide receiver like that. The running back position is inherently going to get injured more than the wide receiver position. So if you're worried about injuries, then you shouldn't draft running backs.
Yeah, and again, in terms of which injuries to quote-unquote target for value and to avoid as landmines, we're going to talk a lot about more in depth this offseason, obviously, on our videos with Dr. Edwin Porras, who, if you guys have been following the channel these past couple of years, has been a huge, widely popular guest of ours in terms of our community. But yeah, I'm excited to get into those videos and really see what injuries we should truly be monitoring and worrying about going into 2022. But from the peripherals, from the look of it right now, I think Christian McCaffrey is closer to being a value like Joe Mixon was, as opposed to a landmine like countless others in the past have been, a la Todd Gurley.
Yep, for sure. So another one that we got right was what Clyde Edwards-Helaire taught us. Yeah. And Clyde Edwards-Helaire was, ADP about the late second round, early third round of most of your drafts. Maybe he even went before that in some of your drafts because he plays for the Kansas City Chiefs, but neither of us had any exposure to Clyde Edwards-Helaire. I don't think I drafted him in one spot, like not an underdog draft, not a redraft league, nowhere, because this connects directly with the JT conversation and almost to the opposite degree, because a lot was assumed about Clyde Edwards-Helaire. Clyde Edwards-Helaire didn't have any actual evidence behind people liking him. I'm sure you heard other fantasy analysts throw around terms like CEH has a top 5 ceiling last year. But like I said with Jonathan Taylor, what was his path to get there? We hadn't seen Clyde Edwards-Helaire in his rookie season get a whole lot of goal line work outside of that first game where he wasn't efficient on that goal line work to take advantage of the elite offense that he plays in. Because yes, he plays for the Kansas City Chiefs, but if all they do is pass in the red zone and hand it to his backup running back, then that doesn't really help him in any way. And he didn't see a lot of receiving work in his rookie year. He wasn't very efficient with the work that he got in his rookie season. So outside of a major talent, upgrade and him like putting it all together and getting better as a player, there really was no path for Clyde Edwards-Helaire to be a league-winning running back or even an RB1 for that matter. And it played out this year. He was the RB23 in points per game, which is exactly what it felt like. A guy that was giving you, middling RB2 production. And the guy that finished ahead of him was his teammate. So Darrell Williams actually was better than Clyde Edwards-Helaire this year on a points per game basis. And Clyde Edwards-Helaire going into the year, like I talked about already with Jonathan Taylor, we should have seen this coming because we didn't have any evidence that he was going to get the career or the carry threshold for an elite season, a target threshold, reception threshold, the goal line work thresholds, the efficiency threshold. All that was really going in favor of Clyde Edwards-Helaire was the offense that he played in. And that's not enough to make you a great running back in fantasy. It's enough to give you RB2 production like a Darrell Henderson, or for example, but it's not enough to give you elite production, which is what we need out of a second round running back. Because again, if you're taking a second round running back without elite upside, then you should be taking a wide receiver because it's way too risky to take a running back in that area of the draft. And on the screen right now, you guys will see that it played out exactly how we should have expected it to play out. In 2021, Clyde Edwards-Helaire finished the Chiefs with 9% of their inside the 5 carries, 9% from their first round running back a year ago, to compared to Darrell Williams' 64%. Now, somebody responded and asked how much of that came when Clyde Edwards-Helaire was out of the lineup. 5 of the 14 goal line carries that Darrell Williams had came when Clyde was out of the lineup. So even still, even when Clyde was on the field, this was still a guy that was getting favored goal line work over Clyde. And same goes for the 6.8% target share for Clyde Edwards-Helaire when he was on the field versus the 9% for Darrell Williams, and the 8% and 36% of the long down and distance and 2-minute drill work for Clyde Edwards-Helaire compared to like 70, 80% for Darrell Williams. He never had top 5 upside, in my opinion. It was all a Fugazi, cue the Matthew McConaughey meme. Like, this was a guy that we should have seen it coming, and thankfully we did. He was my number 1 bust going into the season, and I know you weren't drafting him at all either. So I'm glad we were able to avoid that landmine. I'm sure there's going to be more in the future at running back because that's the nature of the position. But I'm glad we were off Clyde this year for sure.
Yeah, again, I'll quickly address 2 things. First thing, again, for those of you who think I'm kind of all bringing the negative and Corey's kind of bringing the positive here, a lot of these takes we were in agreement with. I guess I'm just going to be the deliverer of bad news in this video particularly. But the other thing I'm going to say is the problem with Clyde Edwards-Helaire is so many people were so focused on the sunk cost. Maybe you spent the rookie 101 on him. You got him in your dynasty drafts. You were amped up about, the upside in the Chiefs offense. And he was a receiving back and he was great at LSU without Joe Burrow. And that's ultimately bias that we have really let carry us forward these past couple years. And really, it's been apparent that CEH is not that elite level talent. CEH is not a Jonathan Taylor. He's not a DeAndre Swift. He realistically was never projected to be that. I mean, the majority of the community had this guy as the RB5 coming into class from a talent standpoint and automatically propped him up to RB1 once he landed in that spot with Kansas City. And ultimately here, again, that's kind of our bias in overvaluing landing spots, supposed landing spots. At the end of the day here, you need both. You need attributed both. You need a guy that's elite talent, you need a guy that's in a good spot to be able to truly encapsulate a ceiling, unless you're a freaking unicorn like Christian McCaffrey. So it was never really in the cards for CH to be an elite level fantasy contributor, and a lot of people should have seen that coming into this year. Luckily, if you guys were following FSC coming into the year, you didn't have much exposure to Clyde Edwards-Helaire because it was very apparent to us going into the year that he was not going to live up to, second, third round type of ADP he was getting.
Yeah, for sure. And I promise this is the last one where I was off of him and Danny was on him, because we are going to get into some that Danny was on and I was off coming into this one. But Ezekiel Elliott definitely taught us some things as well.
Yeah, and again, this is a major point of emphasis that I was wrong on coming into the year. Again, I looked at the peripherals here. All the peripherals of Zeke was looking good. Again, the main lesson I have here, though, is that the age and touch apex for a running back, even truly highly productive league-winning ones in the past, it's freaking real. And Zeke was viewed as having, again, as I mentioned, all of the peripherals. He was a perennial top 5 finisher at the position. He was in a fantastic top 5 projected offense. He had ample pass receiving work. I mean, we're not talking about, a 30, 40 target running back. We've had seasons where he's been able to cross, the 60, 70, 80 target threshold. And of course, as I mentioned with the offense, this was a guy that had double-digit 15, 20 touchdown type of upside. The problem that blinded me was truly the wear and tear that Zeke has been through as a 26-year-old, 6th-year running back, with coming into the year 1,654 career touches under his belt. He's a big oversight on my part in terms of just how much juice really Zeke really had left in the tank. Because at the end of the day, I mean, this is no slight on Zeke. Obviously, in his prime, at the beginning of his career, he was one of the most efficient, most elusive, most really burst-worthy running backs in the league. But again, he's been a workhorse for so long to the point that he's not the same running back he was coming into the league. Again, this is a guy that, no judgment to him on a micro level, it's more so a macro level issue, because we have seen, as you guys will see, the history of running backs in terms of career touches amplifying over their careers, that this happens really to every running back. They lose efficiency. They lose overall value in terms of fantasy points per game. And as a result, they are a lesser player, a washed player comparatively to what they were at the beginnings of the career. Again, Zeke kind of joined the likes of, former fantasy superstars, Todd Gurley, Le'Veon Bell, Melvin Gordon, Devontae Freeman, who have all really succumbed to the tenuous NFL workloads and sharply declined as a result. I mean, you guys can see the true indicator, the bucket of tears, if you will, as to what exactly a player's career touches kind of mean in terms of their fantasy output. And you guys can see increasingly down 1,000 to 1,250, 1,250 to 1,500, 1,500 to 1,750, so on and so forth. As a result, you can see there's an increasing loss of fantasy points per game as they increase in terms of overall career touches. And running backs, as a result, as I mentioned, become inherently less efficient and overall are less useful as they hit certain thresholds of touches. And this grows increasingly up until around 2,000 touches, where if you have 2,000 touches at that point, you're in the Frank Gore, Adrian Peterson territory, where you're not looked at as obviously a useful league winning type of fantasy asset. You know, we're talking about,
You're also probably a future Hall of Famer too.
at that point, yeah. Yeah. I mean, heck, if you made it to 3,500 career touches, then there's a reason why you're still playing in the NFL. But the main players, the main names that we can kind of look for in this bucket going into next year that kind of fit the mold of what exactly Ezekiel Elliott had coming into this year. In terms of the 1,000 to 1,250 bucket, we have Nick Chubb, Aaron Jones, Christian McCaffrey, and Dalvin Cook. In terms of the 1,250 to 1,500 bucket, we have Joe Mixon, Alvin Kamara, and Derrick Henry. And Derrick Henry was actually 5 off of qualifying for the 1,500 to 1,750 bucket. And then it's funny because the 1,750 to 2,000 bucket, realistically, the only name in there that should find his way into really the top 36 of ADP would be Ezekiel Elliott. He's almost at 2,000 career touches at this point. So, again, as optimistic as I was coming into of him coming into the year, I mean, I'm off of him going into next year looking at this data. And there's a lot of interesting names that I mentioned that on the surface would seem to be, you know, these elite fantasy contributors. But, man, this is a real issue we have to look into. Again, I'm more willing to be lenient to, you know, the receiving backs like Kamara and McCaffrey, because at the end of the day here, they're taking less of a grind. They're not like, you know, like a big physical in between the tackles type of runner who is constantly taken down by linebackers. I mean, Alvin Kamara and Christian McCaffrey, for the most part, are doing their damage in the receiving work. But either way, it's a concern nonetheless, and makes me more hesitant in being able to trust those guys at the top of my drafts, in my top 5s, in my top 10s, because the history is not good, to say the least.
Right. And to me, like the hardest example of applying these philosophies is Derrick Henry, because Derrick Henry does have the resume to potentially be a Hall of Fame caliber running back someday. And he's also got the size profile that could indicate that he might be an outlier as well. So he's going to be very, very hard to dissect going into next year, because there's this factor. There's the, you know, when he's on the field, he's Derrick Henry factor. Again, that is going to be a fun discussion going into next year. So we go from what Danny was wrong on in the top, you know, 10 or so picks in the in fantasy drafts to the one that I was wrong on. And I'm sure you guys felt the brunt of this if you drafted this player as well. This was a guy I had ranked 4th among running backs coming into the season, 5th overall among players behind Devontae Adams. But I had Saquon Barkley too high. And what Saquon Barkley taught me basically is that injury optimism is dangerous. I knew it was dangerous coming into the season. I kind of bought into the fact that Saquon might be different. He's got wolf's blood. He's a freak of nature, top 0.01% athlete in the world. The risk wasn't accounted for enough. And I don't just mean the injury, because on top of the injury concerns that we had for Saquon Barkley, investing in an injured running back with an offensive line that I quite literally ranked 32 in our draft guide. I did an offensive line rankings video as well, and I had the Giants ranked 32nd in terms of their offensive line. And also a quarterback that I did not believe in was bad process. It was bad process on my part, so I have to be consistent. I thought Barkley could be the CMC level talent to overcome some of those factors. I thought Kenny Golladay would actually be useful and help, the Giants offense be a little bit better than they were in years past. Saquon Barkley's mere presence on that offense might have helped it be better than it was in years past, but doing that off of a major injury wasn't smart, especially when we saw the signs in the preseason, right? We didn't see him play in the preseason. We didn't see him practice much in training camp. We knew coming into the season that he probably wasn't going to play the first week or two of the season. And in our Tone Setters League and, a couple other places, I still was willing to draft the guy, thinking that, hey, if I get Saquon Barkley for 13 games, it's going to be worth that pick. It was bad process. So if you guys followed that advice, I sincerely apologize, but I definitely also took the brunt of that as well, personally.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned 13 games, because that's exactly what he ended up finishing on. But yeah, and again, I wasn't like low on him by any means. I mean, comparatively to you, obviously I was lower, but I was probably about aligned with consensus. And the problem I also had was the fact that the last time we saw him have that elite efficiency season was really 2 years down the road after such incredible injuries that he was able to overcome. Now again, or to go through. Now again, is that really going to be under the premise of a Joe Mixon going into next year? I don't think so, because at the end of the day here, I mean, we're talking about a guy that is a 235-pound running back, has suffered those significant lower leg injuries, not these ticky-tack, hammy pulls and ankle sprains. Like, we're talking about an ACL tear. We're talking about a high ankle sprain, multiple high ankle sprains in the past couple of years. Like, those are significant injuries. Again, I'm not going to completely sugarcoat this because, again, I was still willing to take him at the end of my first rounds, early second rounds, get him on all of my best ball teams. So although, like, again, this is more applicable for you as Zeke was for me, it's still applicable for me as well because at the end of the day here, I was getting some exposure to Saquon Barkley.
Yeah, and he's going to be just another one of those guys like Derrick Henry. Like, what do we do with this guy next year, right? Because his history suggests that your second year off an ACL tear typically is a lot better, and we saw that with Dalvin Cook a couple of years ago. And if Saquon Barkley is a third-round pick this year, like I'm probably going to pull the trigger in a lot of places. And same goes for Dynasty. I know all the Dynasty heads, especially the analytics people, are really beating the drum and pounding the table that you go buy Saquon Barkley right now because the profile, the production, what he did his rookie season, his second season is all still there. And the injuries that he suffered this year were probably compensation injuries as a result of coming off of an ACL tear. So again, we'll definitely talk about that with Edwin, get into more of the medical stuff about that. But another one that we're going to talk about here is Cooper Kupp, who we were both high on. So this is definitely a hit for both of us. But we weren't as high on him as we should have been, obviously.
And the main lesson I took away here is valuing the number one target on what we project to be a high scoring offense is genuinely a recipe for scoring fantasy points. I mean, Kupp was viewed as, the safe, but lacking a truly a league winning ceiling, mostly due to perceived talent by the industry, because everybody wants to think that they're a scout and say, oh, Cooper Kupp is not Stephon Diggs in the talent, therefore he can't be an elite wide receiver one. And this was despite posting a 134 target, near 1,200 yard and double-digit touchdown season with Jared Goff throwing him the football. We all knew Stafford was an upgrade from Goff and has a history of targeting his number one receiver tremendously. And that Kupp was a perfect scheme fit for what Sean McVay was trying to do on offense. Again, we got this right. We had him as a, top 15-ish type of wide receiver, but even us who thought, the range of outcome was a top 10 low-end wide receiver one could not have expected the best wide receiver season of all time. Like, it's truly remarkable what Cooper Kupp was able to do. And again, we were higher on the market. We had a good amount of exposure on Cooper Kupp, but man, this truly came out of nowhere. But again, the process should have dictated that his ceiling was even higher than what we had anticipated.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I think going back to his 2018 season was definitely something that we should have seen coming, because in the, 6 healthy games that he played, because he left 2 games early, obviously with the ACL tear. And then I think he also had like a MCL sprain before the ACL tear. This is a guy that went, 5 for 52 and a touchdown, 6 for 63, 9 for 162, 2 touchdowns, 4 for 71 and a touchdown, 6 for 90 and a touchdown, 5 for 89 and a touchdown. Like that season that Jared Goff played his best season of his career, Cooper Kupp was his number one guy. And again, we were right on the fact that we were taking Cooper Kupp over Robert Woods, who a lot of people would have taken over Cooper Kupp in a lot of their drafts, because we saw the touchdown upside specifically as a big, major key for Cooper Kupp being over Robert Woods. But the fact that we still weren't quite high enough on him to the point that he wasn't an auto smash for us in every 4th round is a little bit of an oversight on our part. But I ended up with quite a bit of Cooper Kupp, so I'm still pretty satisfied with that result.
Yep, for sure. And we'll quickly go through 2 honorable mentions. Make it a little more brief. I got class coming up, so either way, we'll speed through these guys for you. But the biggest honorable mentions, the one I'm going to get into, was we were right on Leonard Fournette and James Conner. But what did they teach us? What they taught me specifically, I'm sure you can echo similar things, is targeting backs with lead back potential on high-powered offenses are always a safe bet and smart bet to make at the end of your drafts. Again, we're not talking about your RB dead zone round 3 to 7. We're talking about where these guys were going relatively late, like round 9 to 11 type of range. And it's pretty simple. We don't really need to spend much time on it, but the biggest advantage in fantasy football that we can have is identifying a projected, hierarchy in terms of NFL backfields. How should the touches kind of be distributed, and sorting which ones are genuinely useful and can score us fantasy points. After the RB dead zone, as I mentioned, between rounds 3 and 7, there were so many dart throws this year at the tail ends of your draft that at times this year provided RB2 type of value. Again, we're not going to go through like the whole list of them, but Jamal Williams, Tony Pollard are a couple other names, AJ Dillon, a couple other names to be included in this. But the main ones, the main lessons we saw were in Fournette and Conner. The formulas for both were pretty simple. For Connor, it was touchdown opportunity on a high octane offense that vacated a ton of red zone and goal line opportunities with Kenyon Drake's departure. And in terms of Leonard Fournette, I mean, we literally saw a historic 4-game stretch of bell cow usage in the Super Bowl run for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers last year. Yet the majority of the industry, including, it was a 50-50 for us between him and Rojo, but the majority of the community was just like, oh yeah, no, Rojo's just going to automatically reassume his job. Like, no, Leonard Fournette, comparatively, when both were on the field in 2020, when each of them had the opportunity to be the lead back, Fournette was the one that was trusted upon in the 2020 playoffs. And as a result, I mean, we saw what he was able to do this year was a legitimate top 5 running back in terms of points per game. And same with Connor. I mean, this guy scored 18 touchdowns in 15 games played. Like, genuinely speaking, there are these guys every single year. And Fournette and Connor were the biggest ones that support the zero RB theory, where, again, you could get useful RB2 plus production in these late rounds of your draft, yet people kind of stray away from that because it's not the safe option of a Nick Chubb.
Well, not even just Nick Chubb, but like you said, the dead zone running backs, Josh Jacobs, Miles Sanders, the guys that were more so. And I think this is why I don't do projections too, right? Because if you did projections, then you would have had a lot of Mike Davis. You would have had a lot of, Josh Jacobs, guys that you can project for a lot of touches. And you would have projected a split backfield between Ronald Jones and Leonard Fournette and James Conner and Chase Edmonds. And I guess to the other side of the coin, these guys didn't quite work out to the extent of the other guys, but Zach Moss and Devin Singletary, who both had, usable periods of RB2 production. Zach Moss at the beginning of the year, and then obviously Devin Singletary to close the year out. Those backfields were all, the same framework. They were all good offenses. They all had good quarterbacks. They all, were projected to be high scoring, and taking a shot on those offenses to me didn't really feel all that different from taking a shot on Miles Sanders, Josh Jacobs, Mike Davis, Myles Gaskin, Darrell Henderson, anybody in that 4th round, 5th round range, because I saw similar range outcomes for Leonard Fournette as I saw for a guy like Jacobs or, some of the other guys was back end RB1, high end RB2 production.
Yeah, no, again, like I fully agree. And these were guys that, although we did have, some misses in this range, for the majority of the part, we were taking a lot of these Fournette
and Connor were 2 archetypes. Of the top 5 highest owned running backs I had on Underdog. So I was definitely way in on those guys. And Moss was right behind them in that area. But I still, I got some good production out of Zach Moss at the beginning of the season too.
Yep. No, for sure. So overall, the next point that you have and you're going to be making, which we were right on, was the fact that elite quarterbacks were legitimately difference-making type of assets this year. And I'll let you take it away with both the graphic and the explanation behind it.
Yeah, I think the biggest takeaway too is just as an overall thing and to take into next year is that we're getting very good at determining which quarterbacks are going to be elite. And the reason I say that is because, as you guys can see on the screen, these were the top 10 quarterbacks in fantasy points per game this year. Now, if you notice something about these top 10 quarterbacks is that not one single quarterback here was going outside the top 12 or to 15 maybe in ADP. Matthew Stafford and probably Joe Burrow were the lowest 2 drafted quarterbacks in ADP that finished inside the top 10 in points per game. And the reason is because, 3-4 years ago, you could get a Dak Prescott in 2018 in the 15th round of your draft, the 14th round of your draft. If this was 3 or 4 years ago, you probably could have gotten Jalen Hurts with your last pick. But we're too smart now, man, at quarterback. And I don't mean us. I mean, like, as a fantasy community, fantasy players, fantasy analysts, we know what it takes to get an elite quarterback, a lot more, I would say, than other position groups. So the fact that these elite quarterbacks ended up being the elite quarterbacks, and the only guys really that didn't finish in this range were Dak Prescott, who finished quarterback 11. So he was literally right outside this range. Yeah. And I honestly, Ryan Tannehill was the only other one that didn't finish inside the top 10 of points per game. So like Kirk Cousins, a guy that was also going in this range, just finished outside the top 12 as well. Like, this quarterback range, Josh Allen, Justin Herbert, Tom Brady, Kyler Murray, Patrick Mahomes, Aaron Rodgers, Jalen Hurts, Lamar Jackson, Joe Burrow, Matthew Stafford. These were all major, major targets of mine coming into the season. And when I did that, what makes an elite league-winning quarterback video, what I talked about was the only quarterbacks that I want to take outside of these top 12 to 15 in ADP were rookies. They were the only ones that I thought had upside outside of the top 10 or so rounds of ADP at quarterback, because I thought pretty comfortably that if we were going to get a top 3 quarterback finish, it was going to come from Josh Allen or Tom Brady or Justin Herbert, or Kyler Murray, Patrick Mahomes, like all these guys that we know they can provide the dual threat nature to some degree, or they provide an elite passing ceiling like Tom Brady.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. Like, there's such a marketed advantage in terms of having these elite performing quarterbacks. Like, for example, I mean, again, like, we can mention Russell Wilson as kind of being the other disappointment out of this group, if you will, because again, he missed games, wasn't really the same player. But either way, I mean, we see a marked difference between the quarterback 12 or a quarterback 12, in Kirk Cousins in terms of points per game, and the quarterback 13 in points per game with Russell Wilson. Again, he was dealing with injury issues, but if you even look past that, Jameis Winston, Nick Foles, Trevor Siemian, Jimmy Garoppolo, whatever, so on and so forth, there's still a near 2 point per game difference between Kirk Cousins and Jameis Winston. So if you were, I was going to take my quarterback late, I was going to get my quarterback in the last round, you were already at a 2 point disadvantage when if you just taken, Kirk Cousins 2 rounds earlier, you would have gotten the advantage of having a steady quarterback option. And we saw a lot of these guys past that 20 point per game type of threshold, which is what we typically look for in having a safe, secure quarterback one for the majority of the season. So yeah, I fully agree. Again, we're too smart as an industry in projecting guys that can take the next step, guys that can finish in the top 12, that ultimately here as a result of 2021 season proved all these guys, except for again, Russell Wilson due to injury, basically finished as we had them according.
Yeah, and Tannehill as well, due to not injury to him, but injury to his teammates. So that also was the only other one that didn't really quite reach the ceiling that you guys probably were expecting for Tannehill coming into the season. But yeah, that's the end of the video. Again, this is one of our favorite type of topics to talk about, lessons that we can take away, some of the things that we got right, some of the things that we got wrong. If you guys, again, want to leave something that you got right in the comments section or something you got wrong that you want to learn from in the comment section, we'll be happy to converse with you down there. Like the video if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel if you are new. If you want to become a member of the Fantasy Stock Exchange YouTube channel, you can go to our page basically and hit the join button. You'll get some custom emojis and priority response to comments, all that good stuff. So without further ado, guys, peace out. We'll talk to you soon.
Wire me the money.